You are listening to the Neuro Careers Doing the Impossible podcast with Dr. K. Episode number 21, Part 1. Dear Neuro Careers podcast listeners, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce today our podcast guest, Marco Mazzanti, a linguist with a particular interest in psycholinguistics, who speaks multiple languages, teaches languages, and also addresses language-related aspects of science fiction movies. Welcome, Marco. Thank you so much for agreeing to be a guest on our podcast. Can you please introduce yourself and tell us where are you joining us from? From what part of the world?
Well, my name is Marco, and being currently living in Rome, which is the place where I was born and bred, I have always been curious about languages. And by the time I was a child, I would create my own alphabet and secret codes I used to communicate with my mom. It was really nice struggling for her, as you can imagine. Well, I hold a bachelor's degree in modern languages. I studied Slavic linguistics with a particular attention on Russian and Polish. I also studied English and French, since I reckon a linguist should have a wide view of languages and their general patterns. I mean, the mechanisms of syntax, mythology, semantics, phonology, and so on. I discussed a thesis about French borrowings in Russian and Polish. Then I pursued my studies in comparative linguistics and finally got a master's degree in linguistics. I kept studying Russian linguistics, of course, yet I focused on German linguistics and psycholinguistics. It was very challenging for me.
Yeah, I bet it was. And you mentioned your interest from the very beginning. When you still were a child, you were already trying to create your own language. That's so interesting because there is such a variety of languages in the world, but still people tend to create their own language. Where does it come from? What necessitates this need of creating a new language in people? What do you think?
Yeah, by the time I was a child, that was just a game. Anyway, I felt really curious about languages, the way, for instance, my mom and my dad used to talk to me, the sounds of their speaking to me. And as I said before, in my opinion, a linguist should get a wide view of languages and their patterns, even those ones which are located within the human organisms, which means the relationship with human behavior and the way languages are biologically processed in our brains and how our mind embodies them, of course. Linguistics is deeply connected to psychology and biology, in my opinion. Languages change over time, but what happened amongst our neurons and what move this changement inside us, within us? I think that psycholinguistics is aware that languages are related to one's identity and to human personality, to self-worth of an individual, for instance, myself or yourself, everything on this planet. So I think languages are a significant representation or an intimate part of the person, the individual, the human being, so the human organisms. We can just imagine what often occurs if I speak, for instance, English with a heavy accent, or when in Italian I use an incorrect preposition, for instance. I think that language is strictly related to the perception we have about ourselves. I mean, the difference in the individual's representation of what a language must be or ought to be, and it shall be depending on his or her personality and the language is linked to, for instance. But anyway, the fact is that there are no rules. Nothing is set in stone when speaking or writing. A psycholinguist analyzes how our languages displays itself and do that critically with no prejudice. I mean that languages are not a grouping or rules. By the time I was a child, I was told that I had to write or speak in this or that way, but our brain lets us write how we are confident with it. So it depends on our relationship with ourselves, our representation.
What was the most challenging in your studies of languages and then psycholinguistics?
Yeah, I think the brain and its function, absolutely. It was a challenge to discover how brain functions. I'm deaf blown away when reading about brain's function and chemical reaction, thanks to which human beings are able to think and create a representation of themselves. Well, cognitive processes are what I've been studying for years so far, even after getting my master's degree in linguistics. Languages are codes, a system of interaction and communication relating signs to meaning, and they which change over the time. They change over time. It depends on many factors playing an important role anyway. It was very challenging to study and discover it by the time I was a student at university. But I think that everything starts from our brain. We are our brain. I don't believe in the existence of the soul and in nothing but the mind as the product of our biochemical engineers within us inside our head. I mean, the brain, of course, regulating this engine, regulating homeostasis and personality. Well, I consider languages as organisms provided with their own internal equilibrium and sets of deep patterns underlying, for instance, syntax, morphology, phonology, which are what we could see as the personality of our languages. We can see morphology, phonology, syntax as the part of the personality of languages. Our brain is a very complex structure, and analyzing these structures is very challenging, as I said.
However, we're still making a progress with the new brain imaging methodologies. We're discovering different information about how the brain works, how it processes languages, which also helps in brain surgeries where, let's say, seizure focus coincides with the area responsible for language production, for example, comprehension or expressive language. And it definitely helps to avoid certain surgical deficits, aphasias, and so on and so forth. So we progressed quite well. From that standpoint, maybe you have some information why some people are better than others in learning languages.
Yeah, it depends, of course, as we know well, the areas in our brains, for instance, the Broca's areas. This area, for instance, takes the name from the French neurologist Paul Pierre Broca. He identified the relationship between the inability to produce language and a specific damaged brain region located in the left hemisphere. To be precise, he figured out there was a small area located in the lower portion of the left prefrontal cortex. The so-called Broca's aphasia is characterized by a partial loss of the ability to speak and write fluently. Still, the fact is that the compression is intact. Thus, there would have been many other brain regions involved in such activity. According to the German neurologist Karl Wernick, The Broca's area contains a complex code transforming the perceived linguistic information into speech. For instance, in this moment, I'm speaking, I'm talking to you, and the Broca's area is working. This area is linked to the cortical areas, which are responsible for the motor control of tongue, lips, vocal cords. Of course, since that was just an approximate definition of this brain region, and today it is represented in many other subareas, such as the Brodmann area 44 and the Brodmann area 45. Well, if these areas get injured, the result is a slow and disjoint speech scientists usually consider as a disorder related to this area, the Broca's aphasia spectrum. As for another part related to the production of speech, the Wernicke's area is a grouping, and that's a grouping of brain regions responsible for recognition of spoken language. Such region constituting the Wernicke's area are involved in the comprehension of written and spoken language, which means if these areas get damaged, the human organism shall be affected by the almost total absence of meaning of the utterances and led to create meaningless neologisms and excessive use of pronouns too. Well, the disorders belonging to this area, the Wernicke's aphasia spectrum, are characterized as fluent. On the contrary, or what with Broca's aphasia disorders happens. But the problem is that we tend to represent the brain as a static system consisting of separate components that communicate to each other, but having a sole function. This is a very unsophisticated definition, a definition which is at least comfortable, but it doesn't show the reality. The brain is a system we ought to see in its organic totality. I mean, as a network of biochemical processes, chemical reactions, to which we underline the chemical reaction and neurotransmitters released from synaptic vesicles. The fact is that saying a specific area as the region responsible for just one function is a two-dimensional view, in my opinion. We have then a structure that is the first dimension and its sole function, the second dimension. The brain, as far as I'm concerned, in my opinion, I think the brain is actually a three-dimensional architecture when looking at the interconnections between different areas and their several functions. Maybe even a four-dimensional system if we take into account one of its main products, our mind. And consciousness might be seen as a fifth dimension. Why not? Anyway, dimensions are nothing but a metaphor for the same way the tree or wave model linguists use for the genealogy of human languages. Well, let's look at the facts. Each one of the neurons in our brain share an average connection with about 10,000 other neurons. There are therefore trillion of connection and a massive quantity of activation patterns across the brain and its areas, its regions that pertains to our memory systems, which are important for the faculty of the language and the speech production mechanisms, I think. For instance, the cerebellum would play a relevant role in the integration of somatic information, as well as in cognitive processes. The cerebellum, too. If injured, the cerebellum, this structure would generate not only sensory motor problems, but even language disorder. So everything in our brain is very important. Everything in our brain is interconnected. And what about languages? The faculty of language and the languages as codes. Well, as far as I'm concerned, in my opinion, I might be getting told I consider the faculty of language and languages just as a component of a whole class of learnable representation. And yes, it may be true partially, though. Analyzing languages means engaging both data and outcomes. Linguists are to use both a bottom up approach and a top down one. By the bottom up approach, we mean a method based on data driven processing, and therefore a processing through which we start using each one of the individual parts of our brain, of course. For instance, the parts of the languages, for instance, focusing on individual meanings and grammatical patterns and understand how and where every unit of meaning is represented in the brain. On the contrary, by a top-down approach, linguists shall be using a representation-based processing, which would consist of concepts and ideas. Yet I definitely prefer the term representation, in my opinion. A top-down processing could be related to the way human beings or human organisms use the information stored in the brain in order to predict the meaning of what they are going to listen to or to read. Said that psycholinguistics and neurolinguists, of course, aim to figure out to discovering how all this background information are set in the brain and the way it is arranged by our memory systems. Chomsky introduced the concept of creativity, that is the ability of human beings. They are provided of this ability to use the language in a way that is not predictable, to express always new meaning. Above all, theorized the existence of a universal grammar underlying the faculty of language. According to Chomsky, human organisms are not explicitly aware neither of the grammar rules nor of their applications. Each one of the language on earth would share a common and deep, profound structure. Every human organism is able to stem the single rules from through deductive and implicit inferences. As Chomsky points out, children reach a sophisticated and yet implicit knowledge of grammar patterns and therefore of their related applications, and this without getting exposed to feedbackless linguistic stimuli. In fact, a proto-linguistic evolution could have been occurred in previous times by the internalization of linguistic habits, which were learned through, for instance, perception of environment stimuli and integrated afterwards. They would be integrated afterwards, gradually, genetically, in the structures of the universal grammar theorized by Chomsky. Well, some emphasize the role played by the appearance of symbolic thought, which seems to be specific of the human species, which might explain how the episodic memory allowed human organisms to be able to conceptualize the idea of the past and the future. That is the capability to plan events, and everything of this, it's relevant. That extends the vocabulary of human beings in order to describe distant episodes over the time and through the space too, by the grammaticalization. I reckon that languages are related to other cognitive processes such as perception, as I said, concept, So ideas, knowledge of primordial social rules, primordial forms of what we consider as pragmatics and so on. Many of these processes were not to perform linguistic function. Still, yet they probably evolved to interact to one another mutually and to give as a result what we name language.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marco, for this explanation. You mentioned that languages change over time.
Yeah.
You also mentioned this in some of your articles that you published on LinkedIn. And I'm very curious with the current development of the technology and bridging brain and computers, allowing direct communication between human brain and technology, and even brain-to-brain communication, possibility to have implantable neural devices that would allow this communication. What can we expect in terms of changes in language development due to all these changes that are happening in merging humans and machines?
Well, as you know, lots of progresses in neurolinguistics are due to language disorders, aphasia, for instance, also due to create a cure for disease like Parkinson, Alzheimer. So I think all of this disease affect in a way or the other our faculty of language. Well, I think in the future, special devices, microchips in our brain, they will be helping us to comprehend a lot more about the interaction between our brain and our organisms. So I think we'll be having a strict connection between us, of course, and computers. So we'll be able to talk to each other, human beings and computers, through what we normally name telepathy. Of course, telepathy is just a metaphor. Telepathy, as we're used to see in the films, is just science fiction, it's a metaphor, it doesn't exist. But I think that thanks to technology, we shall be able to cure, to resolve lots of problems because of, for instance, Alzheimer, Parkinson's, and aphasias. And we shall be able to get strict interaction to computers through the distance, regardless the space, the time. We'll be able to control through the distance and space our devices, for instance. It could be very interesting. We could create in the future, I think maybe in 50 years, maybe, or in a century, human organisms probably share a strict connection with computer, maybe through biochemical biomechanisms, biocomputers, maybe. Why not?
Yeah, yeah. And this is also possible not only to share that straight connection between the human and the computer, but between human and human through that connection.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why I'm very curious how this would impact the language.
Yeah.
Would it be the same language? Would it be different language? How the language would change if people can just communicate with their own brain?
Yeah.
Without actually pronouncing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, we shall be able to comprehend what happens inside our brain amongst our neural cells during pronunciation and the processes due to which the faculty of languages change in our brains and, of course, over the time. I think that technology will be very useful in the future. Technology ought to be a friend of mankind, and the impact of the technology in our life should be positive, absolutely not invasive, very positive. And that helps us understand in a profound, in a deep way, what happens in our brain. Even what happens in my brain in this moment as I speak with you, for instance, and as you listen to me. Of course, we have the science let us know what happens, but in 50 years, in a century, the technology that shall be help us to comprehend deeply all these mechanisms. And maybe what happened in prehistoric times, by the time the regional language was far away from being invented, for instance, the proto languages, what happens in the mind of our ancestors in order to get a change about their languages? What happened in the mind of a human organisms if when switching languages? For instance, what happens in my mind when talking to you, for instance, in English? In this moment, I'm thinking in English. When listening to an audiobook in Russian, for instance, I think in Russian and in Italian too. So there are many connections between our neural cells, and we shall be able to comprehend in deeper and deeper these movements, these changements, these functions in our brain. And when I develop positive, interesting technology, allowing us to communicating to computers or write, for instance, without a pen or a pencil, we shall be able to write just with our ocular moves. Yeah, that's such interesting. But anyway, as you know, writing, listening, writing with a pen or a pencil is a cognitive activity which is useful, of course, anyway. So we shall be able to use both reading languages, reading by a pen, for instance, and by just thinking. We shall be able to write just by thinking, to note by thinking, and we shall be able to write in different colors. So, for instance, to underline a sentence, if I think, for instance, I light it in red or green, I will be seeing through my glasses, for instance, biochemical glasses, the text. It should be fine. I think it should be fine and interesting. But anyway, don't forget that writing anyway with our hands is useful though for the development of neural population, allowing us to do that.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And it's very interesting if we move towards that technology when we're using our brain primarily for communication, for typing, writing with hands will be getting less and less prominent. So that also would affect our brain. Yes, so I think there are many changes that might be coming in the near future.
Yeah.
And probably we will have more discussion as the technology comes closer and allow us to do such things. But I think it's a very interesting moment in the evolution even of a language, because even the brain is changing. Yes, it's using different additional mechanisms for communication.
Yeah. I think that today, nowadays, we are used to writing through a keyboard, but how many people still write by hands with a pen? I write every day with my pencil,
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of people is not used to write with hands, I think technology will be very important and will be having an impact on our lives.
Yeah.
But anyway, I would like to point out that the ability to write with pencil, to draw, for instance, all of this activity should remain in the life of every day. They are very important for our neural cells. Writing with a keyboard is important, it's nice, it's comfortable, it's smart, but anyway, writing with pens to draw with colors it's very important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And from the brain perspective, from those neural substrates, yes, of processing language and using our various areas of the brain responsible for writing, from that perspective, that makes a difference as well.
There are very lots of perspective to consider.
Yes.
Of course.
Yes, very interesting. Okay, so let's look at other perspectives. You mentioned telepathy as a metaphor, which actually is used in many sci-fi movies. Yeah. And here is where your interest in sci movies is coming from. So can you tell our listeners more? So what inspired your interest in sci-fi movies, and how do you address those movies from psycholinguistics perspective? And maybe you can give even a couple of examples of that. I know you published quite a few articles on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm blown away when watching a science fiction film, movies, and I try to comprehend, to understand the alien languages could be real. They don't, absolutely not. But anyway, that's interesting. One of my favorite movies is Arrival, directed by Denis Villeneuve, and this is a story of a linguist and a physicist recruited by the US government to understand, to crack a regional language used by an alien species who have landed on our planet. And when watching a film with aliens and their languages, as I said, I try to be a critic. Of course, that's just a drama. Aliens couldn't speak and write languages similar to the languages used by human beings. But why? For instance, the regional language used by the aliens in this film is a collection of circular logogram-like symbols. They are interesting. They are an interesting idea, of course, and it seems to be a film based on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, what's known as Whorfianisms, which is generally refused by most linguists, and it postulates that languages influence our world's perception, cognition, and our thinking. So individuals belonging to different language communities should experience reality in a different way. But I don't think so. We ought to consider the role memory plays in the language acquisition over the lifespan. Here is my point of view, and that's my point of view as far as I'm concerned as a linguist. Firstly, I would like to start by saying about all the curiosities and weird, why not creepy too, or cute creatures we come across in movies and science fiction novels. They constitute a psychological projection of environmental elements inside our mind. It means that there is a cognitive representation of them, of the aliens, and the feelings human organisms take inspiration from without being conscious of this most of the time. When described by humans, aliens with their look and their languages are no exception at all. The aliens we can see in movies, they have, for instance, most of the time, two legs, two eyes, an anatomy reminding our structure. So biological approach, which often underlines phylogenetic continuity of cognitive abilities between us and other terrestrial species, in particular mammal, with whom we share many traits. So the evolution is yet a very slow process, and there would be no change for survival on Earth if organisms were not able to learn strategies to escape from danger, defend territory, increase the opportunity to find food resources and reproduce. And in addition to death, according to an evolutionary psychological view, specific features of us, human organisms, our memory and our cognitive abilities, like, for instance, language, the faculty of language, they come out along with the appearance of symbolic thought. Therefore, we would say language, seen as a complex cognitive phenomenon, usually develops later on. So, first of all, a symbolic representation and a faculty of a sort of language afterwards. Many linguists, we say the faculty of language is unique to our species, but actually we should take into account that certain members of the class Mammalia, such as elephant, dolphin, and apes, seems to exhibit a wide variety of behaviors and on many occasions too, even death-related ritual. This would suggest they might possess a sort of basic abstract thinking and probably to understand the concept maybe of life when their conspecifics pass away. So there wouldn't be a language, a code without a symbolic representation in our mind. Last but not least, we cannot rule out that for thousands, well, our existence for thousands or even billions of years ahead, environmental condition might lead our other species and our space, of course, the brain, our brain architecture, to become as developed or even more so than our own, with primary neurological regions capable of understanding and processing, of course, an enormous flow of information and therefore elaborate speech. And maybe also a written language of logogram-like scripts, like in the film Arrival. It was very interesting for me. I really enjoyed this film. Having said that, such a topic may sound more fascinating if we bear in mind that similar evolutionary path might occur on other planets too. It would be very interesting. It would have deep impact on our society. But we don't know. There is, for instance, a civilization on Mars or other planets. We don't know that. We can just imagine, but we imagine that through our representation, through and thanks to our representation anyway. We have to consider that, of course, in a way. We wouldn't be able to represent something whose model we haven't. As I said, most all creatures we can see in science fiction, in film, they have something human-like feature, a brain, two eyes, but aliens could have even three brains. A brain, for instance, for language, another for perception, something very different, distance. I'm not able to imagine something alien in the strict sense of the term. So science fiction is very interesting, yet it could be just an inspiration. And as for me, I don't believe in aliens with green skin, with two eyes, with a mouth through which they are able to speak. They should be very different, very another world. So science fiction is interesting about. It's just an inspiration source.
Yeah, absolutely. An inspiration to even look at our language and language development and communication and even at our consciousness. What can we really imagine, as you said, we're relatively limited by the capacities of our own brain. And maybe some things we even not only we cannot imagine, but even cannot see because of those limitations. And we're also limited not only on perceptual level, but on sensory level. If you think about how limited our capacities even to see the spectrum. And many insects, yes, see very differently and see things that we cannot see, and animals as well. So, yeah, that's a very interesting way to look at things.
Yeah, for instance, I would like to rewrite an article of mine in which I imagine tree-like species whose neural correlates are powered by natural light and when needed by artificial light. So we could even imagine a sort of creature, animal, they're sharing a one-way symbiotic relationship with bacteria like photosynthetic parasites, which link the neural terminal of their massive hosts, the tree-like creature, and provide them the opportunity to communicate to one another, exploiting atmospheric condition and enhancing the sunlight, for instance. So, as I said, we could have a massive possibility of what we could find in the universe, for instance. So, as you said, the faculty of language is limited by the boundaries of our sense for the view. Yeah, for instance, we can imagine, for instance, the past. We can imagine the future. It's very difficult, for instance, to imagine the time represented by a secular time. We represent the time like a line. We have a linear-like vision of the time. It would be very difficult for us to imagine a secular concept of the time. Many cultures on this planet represent, for instance, the secularity of life, death, life, death, life, and so on. But anyway, the direction we have ourselves is a line. When speaking about myself, I think about myself as a child, its moment in my past, and the past is something behind me. If I think, when thinking about myself in the future, I imagine it something before me. Anyway, so as you said, we have anyway a perception. I think that the perception of our the reality is linear, is a line. despite the many many philosophies imagine the time, the life as a circle. It could be true. It could be true. Why not? But anyway, the perception we have of reality is a line. So, and thanks to the ability of thinking about the past and about the future, we can, through our languages, to concept, to create, for instance, past tenses, preposition, postposition, perfective and imperfective form. It depends on the ability that human beings have to feel their reality. So if we had a secular perception of the reality, probably we would have also a different type of language, a different type of code. Languages are code, and of course, a different faculty of language. It would be very different. But as I said, we don't know whether the aliens exist or not, and how and what they look like. They could exist, but they could be just some fishes-like creature, tree-likes, nothing having to do with civilization, technology, and last but not least, if they have an abstract thinking. I think that due to the abstract thinking, we are able to have also our language, the faculty of language, and of course, languages. Languages can be both written and spoken. We have also sign languages, for instance. So to sum up, I mean that we, as human beings, we have nothing but a limited view of what our languages may be.
Dear Neuro Careers podcast listeners, I hope you enjoyed this amazing podcast with Marco Mazzanti. Please stay tuned for the second part of this podcast episode, where Marco will share with you best strategies for language learning. Thank you so much for listening to our Neuro Careers podcasts.